welcome to our last unit, Romanesque and Gothic, where we will begin with the Romanesque, focusing primarily on architecture in this unit. So Romanesque art we're in Europe, and it's approximately from 1000 AD to the rise of the Gothic style in the 12th century. Now, Gothic art comes about mid-12th century, and there's elements of it, even through the 16th century, but we're primarily focusing through about 1300-ish. Because then comes the Renaissance, which is for next semester. So let's start with the Romanesque period. So there are some major political changes in the 11th century, and as we know by now, whenever there are political changes, we see changes in art. So let's talk about some of that. First, you have this great fear with turning of 999 to 1000. I remember this because I was in middle school for Y2K whenever we were shifting from 1999 to 2000. And so this always marks some type of fear of change. And so in this regard, there was this fear of the rapture coming, of what Christianity predicts for Christ coming back. And so there was this interest more in the church, of looking to the church for answers and for assurances during this time of fear, essentially. And so there's this increase in the popularity of the church. And so there's this expansion of monasticism, so monks and nuns dedicating their lives to Christ and, increasing the power and claims of the church. Fall of the Roman Empire, that's gone. There's also a major change in everyday life. So we are not yet in a time period where the middle class whatsoever exists. It doesn't really come about till the 1500s, really, with capitalism and these Dutch merchants, where the middle class first arises in human history. We're at a time period right now where everyone is mostly in abject poverty, and then you have a few who are very, very wealthy. And for the last few hundred years, we've had serfdom, where these landowners would own a lot of land, they're extremely wealthy, and they would have people working the land. But there were so many people who needed jobs that this enabled these landowners to pay so very little. It was not a livable wage. And if you went in as this farmer and you asked for an increase in wages, these landowners could just say, oh, well, I have 10 other people who want the job, so too bad, take what you get. But then what we have is this plague, and it really actually starts during Justinian's time period. He actually even got the plague and survived, but it does wipe out quite a bit of the population in Europe. Now, this is not the bubonic plague that comes later, though it had similar characteristics apparently. But either way, there's a decrease in population. So now these landowners can't claim, oh, there's 10 other people lined up for the same job, get what you get. And so there's this increase in wage to an extent. It's a little more livable. But what we also have is this population increase in cities. People are flocking to the cities. We have the emergence of the craft industry. Think of almost like a pre-modern assembly line to an extent, where, let's say, there's your shoes that need to be made for this increased population. And so you have someone who's sewing on the sole of the shoe, and you have someone who's doing the laces, and you have someone who's doing these other parts, etc., etc. And so now there's just more options with jobs, essentially. And so people can move to the cities as well if they aren't happy with their wages out in the country because of this craft industry. There's the Great Schism that happens in 1054. This is when the Roman Catholic Church is divided between the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox. There's the Norman invasion, in which Normans invade England. And there's also Halley's Comet in 1066, which is marked in art. And we even talked about how in America, the Serpent Mound, how that was likely a reaction to Halley's Comet. So a lot's happening. We have discussed the cathedral plan, which you need to know, and I want to talk about this cruciform layout. So consider this like a cross, symbolic of Jesus at this point, in which he was crucified. And so you have this cross layout, and what we're going to see with the Romanesque period is a slight change as they accommodate so many more people who are attending these churches, or what becomes these massive cathedrals. So first of all, we're going to have another set of aisles added. Okay, so we have 2 sets on either side. This is to accommodate the growing number of people, of pilgrims who are coming into these cathedrals as they walk around. So that, let's say if there's sermon going on, people are standing in the center, then they aren't interrupted. So again, this is to accommodate more people. We also have what's called these radiating chapels. So actually, let me even back up before that, is we have this massive increase in pilgrimage. So hopefully you're familiar with this. You need to know the details of all this and how the church changed their structures to accommodate these pilgrims based on your reading. But what they're doing is they're demonstrating their faith as they are walking and taking this pilgrimage to these sites to see these relics. And so these churches must accommodate. Now, in order to build these bigger structures, you need funding. One of the ways in which they would raise these funds is through the idea of these radiating chapels. And so we'll see these little radiating chapels around the aisles, and they're like little niches to an extent. And you would appeal to the nobility in these areas, where they would either rent out this chapel, and it would be the family chapel, or they would essentially buy it. And they would show their artwork, or they would patronize artists to have artworks within it, oftentimes depictions of themselves. And so think of this as a power move. As not only are you being a good Christian, donating to the church, but as all these worshipers are here, especially with locals, and they're looking around during this sermon, they see your image within it. So it reinforces the idea of your status and of your power. So that's one of the big reasons how they would raise funds. There's many instances of where these patrons are buried underneath the church. And part of that idea was that if you were buried within this church, under one of these chapels or one of these areas, under this stone floor, is that you basically had like a ticket to heaven because you were buried in such a holy area. You could live a really crappy life and then pay for your burial underneath the cathedral, and you've got a ticket to heaven. So this is one of the factors which leads to the Protestant Reformation a few hundred years later, this dissatisfaction. But that's for next semester. Anyway, so they're raising funds to accommodate many more people that are coming, and so they have to build bigger structures for this. So we see this shift. So let's talk about Santiago de Compostela in Spain as one of these examples of a Romanesque church. So these Romanesque churches are built out of stone. One of the big reasons for that is they're quarrying from the areas, but also they are fireproof because it is stone. We are moving away from these wood churches that burn down in these more densely populated areas of these areas. Well, I say that. Gothic goes more into the cities. Romanesque churches are actually still on the outskirts. They are more of a hike to get to, essentially. This is one of them in Galicia, Spain. I had a picture of the map. Anyway, this is on the very edge of Spain. It's before the New World has been discovered. In Europe, this region of Spain is considered like the edge of the world. So you as a pilgrim are really demonstrating your faith, your piousness by taking this long pilgrimage route to like the edge of the world, demonstrating your devotion. And they had some good relics here. And what we have is this barrel vault. So one of the reasons why this is called Romanesque, which means Roman-like, but the nomenclature is very confusing. As you can see, there's very little that is Roman-like. You could argue we have some columns and we have arches. It's pretty much where we're at. So just whenever you're referring to things that are Roman-like, think of art from the few centuries where we studied ancient Greek and Roman art, or references to it, is that we don't want to use the term Romanesque. Romanesque is only for this region. And again, this era. And it is a little bit deceiving because it doesn't seem so ancient Roman-like. If you see, let's say you're at a museum and you see stuff that reminds you of ancient Greek and ancient Roman art, then you would say, oh, that's classical or Greco-Roman. So anyway, so back to our Romanesque. We have these barrel vaults that help hold up this structure because the good old arches that the Romans invented. And you also have this, on the exterior, what we have are these tympanums. Okay, so this pretty much a semicircle area. And you're going to have detailed messages from the Bible, detailed stories. Oftentimes, which we'll talk about the Last Judgment as this warning before you walk in. So you have all these pilgrims. You have many people who are attending these churches or going inside. But remember, the majority of our population is illiterate. So you have to be able to communicate these messages and these stories through the visual form. We have this long nave, before I forget. We see these aisles, this double aisle. Okay. There we go. Oh, with the shift into Gothic, Gothic becomes taller. Romanesque is slightly shorter. So let's talk about some of the imagery. Here are some nave capitals at another church. Now the Romanesque period, the church has the foremost authority during this period. And one of the big reasons why we see this shift in these very not naturalistic or even idealized figures is because you don't want anyone to have impure thoughts about the human body when looking at these depictions within the church. And so you aren't depicting the human body in an appeasing way. In other words, it's not very aesthetically pleasing. But the purpose of that is so that you aren't having impure thoughts about the body. So it's purposeful. And of course, you're focusing on the concept. And so here we have this example of an Old Testament story of Samson and the lion, and indicative of the ancient world. Here is the lion, in which we can tell that not many people in this area had seen a lion. They likely saw some drawings of someone describing a lion, etc. We do have a capital. Here's your Roman-ish reference. But the bodies are very squat. They're somewhat abstracted. They're quite stylized. So you're focusing on the message without creating a body that people could have impure thoughts about. And I mean, think back to our late antiquity and the end of the Roman Empire, where the tetrarch bodies had already become a little bit squat. Here's the abduction of Ganymede, which is interesting because this is an ancient story of Zeus essentially seeing the most handsome man, or this youth, and he kidnaps him and brings him up to Mount Olympus because he's just too beautiful for Earth. He needs to live with the gods instead. And so he had turned into this gargoyle-like, intimidating Zeus. Monstrous Zeus turns into this bird and brings him up to Mount Olympus. And so this pagan god is depicted as very monstrous. Some arguments about this art piece is that it's discouraging people from preying on the young monks, elderly monks preying on younger monks. It seems like a stretch. This is just your familiar story of discouraging vanity, etc. We have this long nave. Here are those capitals that I was just referring to. And again, these are quite stylized bodies. They aren't realistic by any means. Now let's move on to the Church of St. Foy as an example of this pilgrimage site in which people are visiting to see an important relic. It's extremely Romanesque. We have these arches, these towers. Here's our nave. We are in France. So this is a pilgrimage church. Around it is this thriving monastery in which monks would be living. We have, it becomes a popular site, and in fact it's on the way to that Church of Santiago that we just saw. So pilgrims on their way would be stopping here. I mean, some would purposefully come here, but it was on a major pilgrimage route. So we're going to talk about this tympanum over the doors of the main entrance. So consider the size. Again, we have our aisles, we have our radiating chapels. This one only has one aisle, but for the most part, consider two. Let's check out this tympanum. You'll notice one of the things why this is probably one of the most famous of the Romanesque period is we still see some remnants of paint. Like the ancient world would have been brightly painted. So here is the scene of our last judgment. Again, you're communicating these stories to a primarily illiterate culture. This is over the entrance to this church. So you also have some power moves going on, just like with any structure, essentially. And so there's this warning. So again, this scene from the New Testament, the end of the New Testament with Revelations and the Last Judgment, that after death you will be judged and decided whether you're going to the heavens or to hell. Okay, to heaven or to hell. Christ is centrally placed. We see this hierarchy of scale. The main focus is on him just by the composition. He even extends over the top register. And we're divided into 3 registers. So we're going to go into some certain aspects of this. He is surrounded by this imagery of these stars, and that's pulled almost directly from Revelations, where it says 4:3, there was a rainbow round about the throne. So we have this reference to here. And you're trying to communicate this idea of following Christianity, adhering to the principles of Christianity, believing in Jesus Christ as your Savior in order not to go to hell. So here we have Christ, and look at the paint that we see here. So now we are in the era where Christ is depicted with a beard. This has been established. He is a little bit more realistic and idealized. The proportions are a little bit more correct rather than the squat figures around him. Again, because this is Jesus Christ. So if you are going to show anyone in a pleasing manner, it will be Jesus. So here we have images, for those who could read, we have Latin script all around that, referring to descriptions in the Bible. Angels. So we're looking to the left of Christ. When we're looking at it, it'll be to our right. And so here we have this angel holding these books. And so there's this idea of adhering to the Christian principles of the Bible, etc. And we have this angel holding a spear. We have this angel holding, look at our shield and our sword, etc. in this book. Now, the reason why the right side is holding these weapons, the left side is holding, there's this incense burner in this book, is because, again, the right side of Christ, think Christ's right-hand man, Justinian, think back to that, is where heaven is depicted. His left side was where hell is. So these two angels are holding weapons to stop these creatures, etc., coming from hell over there. So here we have this imagery of St. Michael weighing the souls. This is right beneath Christ. And so again, what you've done in life shall be weighted. Think of this imagery that goes all the way even back to ancient Egypt, weighing your life of this final judgment. The scales are missing right here. There used to be scales versus these demonic creatures, and this idea of torturing if you haven't lived that good life that you're supposed to. In here we have St. Foy. So this is the Church of St. Foy. And we'll talk about her and how she became a saint. But right here, she is kneeling before the hand of God, where just his hand is depicted. So that goes all the way back to our Dura Europa. I realized that the reading didn't discuss that when I was unable to give that lecture, so I updated a description in D2L for you for that exam image. But essentially, again, so you're not depicting God. The idea of this bearded, white hair, white bearded man doesn't come about to the Renaissance. Before, we're just seeing the hand depicted as God, that his hand is a part of this. And so St. Foy is kneeling before the hand of God. So there we have our top couple registers, St. Foy, Wain of Souls. Here on the bottom register, in heaven, we see Abraham, his sons, and they're in the New Jerusalem, right? Over here on the right was where Satan is torturing the damned, and Satan is depicted extremely ugly. I mean, and these demonic forces are supposed to be extremely ugly. It's supposed to be gross. It's supposed to be scary. In this warning as you walk into this church of not to live a life that will lead you to here. Abraham, sons, we're in the New Jerusalem, coming of Christ. Here's the Last Judgment. Okay, so the reason why you're coming to this church specifically is to see the reliquary with the relics of St. Foy within. So this is the reason for your pilgrimage, is for this reliquary. So the reliquary refers to the container that's holding these relics within it, essentially. So St. Foy, which actually means Saint Faith, this girl Faith, was a saint who was a victim of Diocletian's persecutions in the 3rd century. So let's go back way to the Roman Empire. We have the split of it. Started with Diocletian. Before our next person, Constantine, makes Christianity an acceptable religion, is before that there's this girl who was killed for her belief in Christianity in the 3rd century. And so the relics of part of her body, most of the time relics are like the bones of a saint, were actually in another church for a long period of time. And there was this common stealing of relics by different churches in order to gain more pilgrims to come to your church. And here's one example of where this monk basically faked that he was a monk for another church in which the relics were originally, and he ended up stealing them and bringing them to this area. And so in the 9th century, you create this reliquary to hold these relics. And later on, many of these precious gemstones are added as they gain more funds from these pilgrims that are attending this, who are coming into this church and making these donations. However, the interesting part is that this is an example of reusing a previously used object. And the head was actually taken from the head of an ancient Roman statue of a child. And within it is some skull fragments of St. Foy, in the bust actually, which the bust is made from a repurposed ancient Roman helmet. So interesting. Yeah, but here we have our figure, not idealized. Again, we don't want any impure thoughts about the human body, but look at how elaborately bedazzled, essentially, it is on this throne. So think back to where we talked about with the fibulae and the clonoise and in front of the illuminated manuscripts, and how we're seeing that motif of these jewels and embedded precious, semi-precious stones, etc. So that is our reliquary. And so these pilgrims would come to this area to get a glimpse of this, of these relics that are here. Think of how even back to the stupas from the beginning of Buddhism, or the spread of Buddhism, I should say, and how his relics were housed, the ashes, but they were housed within the center of the stupa. And so this is appealing in human nature. Now here is another example of the Last Judgment on another tympanum. So this was a really popular motif to show on the exterior of these churches that you would be walking underneath, that would serve as this warning. And so I wanted to use this one to show a little bit of a difference in our style, and we have these very elongated figures. And we looked at a lot of squat ones, but we do have some elongated ones. But they're still somewhat stylized. We aren't seeing realistic images, but this central figure is always going to be Christ. And so this imagery is familiar. And over here we have underneath the bottom register is we have these souls lined up to determine whether they're going to heaven or to hell. But this is a popular motif. Okay, so let's shift up into England, and where we're going to go into a more political depiction with our Bayeux Tapestry. And so we're moving out of a more Christian religious imagery and discussing the Bayeux Tapestry. So this is an artifact that depicts the Norman conquest. The name Bayeux Tapestry doesn't actually reflect this artwork. So I've seen that a few times where the nomenclature is a little off. Because Bayeux was the cathedral in which it was housed. We don't know if it was even originally meant to be there. The name came about later. And it's not actually a tapestry. This is a tapestry, okay, where it's all woven together. This is embroidery, where you're sewing into this one, linen, to create these images. So it's actually, it should be called the Bayeux embroidery, or the Norman conquest of England embroidery. And anyway, so it depicts the Norman conquest of England in 1066. This was the struggle for the throne between William, the Duke of Normandy, and Harold, Earl of Wessex. So you watched that video about that. I wanted to show this YouTube video because it depicts daily life, the battles, coronation, and where these people, potion pictures, are showing this continuous narrative. That's Hallie's comment, a reference. So it was crafted by anonymous embroiders. We don't know who. It's this really high quality needlework. It's the stylistic qualities of this Anglo-Saxon region. And it's depicting this major event that occurred. Offers insight into 11th century normal life of the dining practices, what their battle gear was like, their military strategies, construction techniques. It highlights William's strategic use of the cavalry, the brutality of war, wounded soldiers, horses, etc. So it's really this blend of art. It's a historical chronicle. It's political propaganda, of course. It's made by the victors. And it tells us about construction techniques of this time period. This pivotal moment in history for this region. And it has a depiction of Hallie's comment, because this was a major event, pretty extraordinary sight. Here's Westminster Abbey, still used today. You may be familiar with it. Depicted at our hand of God coming down. Coronation. And there ends our Romanesque lecture. Tomorrow we will study the Gothic period.